Good evening. My name is Ana Cavalcante, and this is my final presentation for Introduction to Latin American Studies. My subject matter is Brazil. Brazil is the largest country in South America and the fifth largest in the world. It has a population of 210.7 million people, and the official and most widely spoken language is Portuguese. The capital is Brasília. There are 26 states and one federal district. The currency is the real, and the government type is a federal presidential republic. The current president is Jair Bolsonaro. Brazil's colonial history. Brazil was claimed by the Portuguese and colonized as well in 1500. It originally had 15 captaincies that were established in 1533, and Portugal at first saw it as an economic colony, but eventually it really played a large role in Portugal's economy and development. As well as during the Napoleonic Wars, it served as a refuge for the royal court of Portugal. Portuguese Prince Dom João transferred the capital of Portugal to Rio de Janeiro in 1808 when Napoleon invaded Portugal. He eventually returned to Portugal, him and the royal court, but his son, Prince Dom Pedro, remained in Brazil and declared Brazilian independence on September 7th, 1822. He established the Brazilian Empire and was the first emperor. Later on, slavery was abolished in 1888, and the following year, the empire came to an end, and the first republican government of Brazil was established on November 15, 1889. Brazil as a Portuguese colony. The capital was originally in Salvador, Bahia, which was a large port that brought in slaves and exported resources. Again, Brazil was very rich in resources, including sugar plantations in Pernambuco in the northeast. Portugal saw it, again, as an economic colony, so there was competition with the Dutch and French who tried to establish colonies, the Dutch in the northeast and the French in Rio, but eventually the Portuguese and local landowners drove them out, and more Portuguese migrated to Brazil. Jesuit missionaries moved inland to convert indigenous people to Christianity, and Bandeirantes moved inland to enslave indigenous people. There was also a gold rush in Minas Gerais that led to many people moving to that area of Brazil. Slavery in Brazil. Slavery in Brazil was very widespread. An estimated 4 million African slaves were trafficked into Brazil. 40% of the slave trade in the New World went to Brazil compared to 10% going to the United States. Again, many slaves were brought to Brazil, and one of the reasons was because many died on the voyage over and in the terrible conditions of the plantations. These slaves were used on sugar plantations, coffee plantations, mines, and as household workers. You can see the bottom right picture is on a coffee plantation. The top is a slave raising a white child as wet nurses, and on the bottom left, they worked in the household as well. Gender roles in Brazil. Gender roles in Brazil are influenced by behavioral, social, and historical factors. Machismo, just like most of Latin America, machismo is a gender role that men are expected to follow and be part of, formulate. It is hypermasculinity, and it is characterized by violence and pride, and it reinforces the patriarchy. It really places more value on men and their role, and this has a historical factor and is influenced by history because, again, Brazil and much of Latin America was male-led colonization. Its counterpart is Marianismo, which is also influenced by the Catholic Church, as white women are expected to follow in the image of Virgin Mary. So they're expected to be symbols of purity, motherhood, domestic and submissive. They're supposed to be the good wife, the childbearers, the mother of the home, and as such. Men are expected to play a role in public life, while women are more restricted to private life. This is mostly for white women, as black women are actually they're hypersexualized and hypersensualized, and this goes back, again, historical influences with the gender stereotype for black women being the Jezebel, which paints black women as promiscuous and having less morals than white women. Again, that male-led colonization meant that many men abused and raped black women that were slaves, as well as indigenous women, because there weren't as many white women and because they were held to that symbol of purity, while the black woman was supposed to be promiscuous and lustful. So that, the patriarchy, machismo, marinismo, and Jezebel also created more competition between white women and black women. That competition and that perspective, that view of black women and white women being seen in different lights has an influence even nowadays, as in the bottom left you can see an ad for beer that sexualizes black women, comparing the product and the black women together, comparing them, and it's talking about the body and the shape. Anyway, so these gender roles do have effect on society nowadays. So going from that, femicide rates in Brazil, violence against women in Brazil is very high. Femicide is defined by the World Health Organization as the intentional murder of women because they are women. Brazil has the 5th highest rate in the world. Global reported that 12 women are killed every day in Brazil because they're women, and most of the time it is because of domestic violence. And going on from that, in terms of intersectionality, again, rates are higher for black women. It is 71% higher for black women. So there is that double marginalization. Going along with that, gender inequality is still present in Brazil. There is a gender gap. Women earn 30% less than men, and black women earn even less. Black women, again, doubly marginalized because they are women, and because they're black, they're underrepresented. And women in general are underrepresented in public life decision making. They make up 51% of the population, yet only 10.5% of the seats in the Chamber of Deputies are occupied by women. And when you look at CEO positions and managerial positions, the rates are much lower for women compared to men. And again, the gender gap, for every 2 highs and 30 cents that a man earns, a woman earns 1 how and 76 cents. So gender inequality still persists. New democracies, crime, and corruption. Brazil had a military dictatorship from 1964 to 1985. That dictatorship ended in 1985 when Tancredo Neves was elected the first civilian president since the dictatorship. Unfortunately, Tancredo Neves passed away before he was inaugurated as president, and his vice president Sarney was inaugurated as president. He was president when the new constitution of Brazil was drafted in 1988, and there have been many highs and lows in Brazilian politics and history since then. I'm going to focus mostly on modern history. And so later on in 2002, Lula was elected president, and he really marked a turning point in revolutionary era in Brazilian politics that has changed once again now last year. Corruption in Brazil. Brazil has a long history of corruption, including President Collor. In 1992, an impeachment trial was initiated against him for money laundering. However, he resigned before before the trial actually finished. So that actually added to the movement and a factor that influenced later on Lula's rise to power. So Operation Lava Jato, the next slide is going to be all about that, heads up. But here's some basic facts. President Lula was arrested and sentenced. Dilma was impeached, and Temer, who took over the presidency after Dilma was impeached, was also arrested. So Operation Lava Jato. Operation Lava Jato, which translates to Operation Car Wash, was an anti-corruption probe launched in 2014 by Judge Sérgio Moro, and it began with an investigation into money laundering that uncovered a huge network of corruption. And it's called Operation Car Wash because that was the front for the money laundering. It was car washes and gas stations, and they weren't really expecting to find such a huge network of corruption that reached from the highest points of society. And it really exposed corruption between the petroleum multinational Petrobras, the construction giant Odebrecht, and other corporations and government officials. It implicated corporate executives, Brazilian politicians, and foreign leaders as well. And because of that, it has been cited as the biggest corruption scandal in history, just because it ranged from CEOs, billionaires, to former presidents, to governors, deputies, all over, including international figures. So multiple parties, government parties, and the local Brazil government were involved. More than 200 convictions and billions of dollars were misappropriated. And Operation Lava Jato spurred on other investigations. What was really groundbreaking was because Brazilians are so used to having corruption, but nothing really being done about it. There's a saying, acabou em pizza, ends in pizza, because nothing happens in the end. And Operation Lava Jato was really something revolutionary to the Brazilian people, because these billionaires were actually being accountable for their actions. And these politicians, again, I can't stress this enough, Lula was very popular. He left office with double-digit approval ratings in the 80s. And then a decade and a half later, he was being imprisoned. Same with Dilma, his successor. Her ratings flung down to single-digit ratings. So there was a massive public outcry, dozens of demonstrations demanding impeachment and arrest. As we can see here, there were marches, there were dances, there were petitions. The Brazilian people really rallied against how much corruption was going on and how it was exposed. And on the bottom left is Judge Moro, who was really hailed as a Brazilian hero. And so Lula was arrested, Dilma was impeached, and it was really the end of an era for the party, the Workers' Party. Crime in Brazil is unfortunately very high. Common types of violence are related to drug, domestic violence, and police violence too. In 2017, Brazil had reported 63,880 homicides, but most of them were connected to drug trafficking. Again, Brazil is so huge, so big, that a lot of its borders, it does border countries that have lots of drug trafficking as well. And so, again, drug cartels are mostly responsible for violent crimes and the highest murder rates. Those border states are like Acre. Often the violence happens there is really gang violence and turf violence because of the trafficking routes. Two big crime groups currently include the Red Command and the First Capital Command, PCC, and those were born out of prisons, actually. And again, they're usually related to drug trafficking. Again, there's a lot of factors that go into crime, but that's a whole other thing of its own. So conclusion and reflection. From this project and this whole semester, I really gained a lot more insight into Brazilian history and its influence on current trends. I am Brazilian, but I did not do secondary school there, so there's a lot of Brazilian history, like the nitpicky stuff that I didn't really learn as much about, and this was really the opportunity that I had to learn more about my own country's history. And I also gained a better understanding of Operation Lava Jato and its implications. I accompanied it and followed it when I was in the news, but this was an opportunity to learn more and really research on my own. And my conclusion and reflection is that Brazil is really in need of a massive political reform relating to its criminal justice system, to how it treats gender violence and gender inequality, to corruption, and really holding public officials accountable for their actions and for the posts that they fill. And in conclusion, this was really a great opportunity for me to learn more about my own culture and heritage. So these are my sources, and thank you for listening.